were talking about the rewrite and the motivation for the rewrite. So there's a couple of blog posts about this, which I'm sure we'll link from somewhere. But the general idea was that we were at a bit of a technological dead end. So using we had been using OCaml, and the idea at the start when we started Dark in 2017 of using OCaml was like, we want to use something like the language that we're creating, and we don't know what the right technology is, but this one is like statically typed, and so it will allow us to refactor things pretty quickly. And I'd done some experiments with other statically typed languages like Haskell that I wasn't super pleased with, and I was like, let's take a shot on this, and honestly, it worked out pretty well. We were able to refactor things very well. We were able to have like, the code worked largely when it was written, and we didn't have a whole lot of problems with like reliability of the code base. But what we had was, it was challenging to use new things. So, if we wanted to use a cloud thing, for example, we would have to write the drivers to it or the SDK to it or whatever. Really, the only thing that was well supported was sort of the more mainstream databases. So, for example, Postgres, has pretty good support. But if we wanted to do something different than that, we wanted to use like real queues, for example. That's not something where there's a driver that exists. That's something where we have to where we would have to create the driver ourselves, or just not use it. And so we ended up just putting everything in the database, which is a terrible idea. You shouldn't have your queues in a database. You shouldn't have your cron jobs in a database, but that's where it all lives at the moment. And so part of the idea was, if we are going to switch the technology, we should. And if we're not going to switch the technology, we should just make a decision to double down on OCaml and start to do things properly. And eventually the decision was to change the technology. And the thing that was sort of leading the whole thing was that OCaml wasn't a multi-threaded async thing. It had support for async, but we hadn't built any of it into our thing. So there was going to need to be some sort of rewrite anyway. The idea was that if we were going to have to make a change, now was the time.
Cool. And how's that been going? The F# rewrite.
It has been going pretty well. It's taken longer than intended. So I thought, I remember writing, I forget whether it was a blog post or an email, that after about 2 months, it's like, oh, it's nearly done, and I've almost got it finished, and I did not even close to have it almost finished. So it's been going a little over a year now, so I think 14 months, and it's going pretty well. It is like it is nearly done, as much as one can say that something is nearly done, but it is it is nearly it is good. I think that's the thing. Like, as far as things have gone, it has gone much better than I expected. So for the most part, you expect that, like, rewrites are risky. It's one of those things that you should never do. And in terms of like how stuff works and how the code has ended up, like, I'm really happy with how everything has gone. So I'm not regretting it. I'm very much glad that we did it. I'm also very much glad that we're getting to the end of it, because I'm kind of sick of this and would like to do some new stuff.
Yeah, I guess I can act as a third party and say that is actually almost done. I know the first 80% happens, and then there's the second 80%. I think it's actually very close. Having looked through most of the code, it's not most of the code, but a fair amount of the code, I can attest to it being nearly there. And yeah, it looks great. I think in the large part, it does seem to match the source code pretty well, which is nice. And I think it provided a lot of interesting technical challenges too, in terms of like fuzzer tests, making sure that
Hmm.
that OCaml dark code behaves the same way as the F sharp runtime and all that. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that the rewrite sort of enabled us to do was to like really increase the amount of testing. So there was barely any testing. I think there was like 250 tests, and there's now about 9,000.
Hmm.
Um, and you've seen the statue, but there's a um, uh, I made a sort of a DSL for writing programs in Dark. Um, and it just uses, just reuses the F sharp parser because it's like close enough. And so you write F sharp that looks like Dark, and then the interpreter runs things. And so you can write tests in like one line now that used to take, it used to be like 10 lines, and you had to add it below, and you had to add it to a list here, and then you had to recompile the whole thing. Um, and actually, because it's sort of at runtime, you don't have to recompile anything even for the test. So it's, it has really been easy to add new tests, and that has really bumped up the amount of test coverage, and discovered a whole rake of problems in like a bunch of the existing standard libraries, which are terrible. So like a lot of the date stuff can have negative answers for some reason, that we will fix once we have made the transition over. We'll make new versions of those functions. Um, but yeah, really happy how a lot of that stuff turned out.
Oh, sorry, my mic was off. Yeah, it has been nice to see one line tests. That's really convenient there. Uh, you mentioned that being an OCaml blocked a number of things. Have you been able to unblock some of those things or kind of deal with some of those problems along the rewrite, or have you been just focusing on getting one for one parity with the OCaml
I
version?
started by trying to be clever and do a couple more things. So, for example, I tried to turn um, the HTTP stuff into a middleware framework that was written in Dark, um, and that was actually really hard, and that ended up being just like bad. Um, and where it ended up being bad was just that the semantics were different, and anywhere where I sort of made a compatibility change was something where I just wasn't sure if the code was going to work when it was done. Um, so I backed away from that a little bit, and really focused on making everything one for one compatible. Um, and didn't manage to make everything 100% compatible. There's some little differences in sort of the JSON representation, and that sort of thing. But for the most part, everything has been pretty much the same. There's a change log, in the in the I will link to it, in the docs, where we sort of link, the or where I described like the number of changes that existed, and really it wasn't that bad at all. It's certainly very tolerable, but I've really had to focus on that. And the initial thing was like, oh, I'm going to fix all these things at the same time. It's like, no, that was a bad idea.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen notes now that we're really at the end there. I've seen notes of starting to turn on the F sharp version for certain canvases. Can you speak to that and and what that's like, and when do you think users can start to flip over things themselves, or how that's going to play out?
Yeah, so I started doing that, this week, of trying to enable Dark on at the start, just one user, the one I specially created, try Dark F sharp. And actually I haven't been able to flip it on yet because again, because I tried to be clever. So I was, in Kubernetes. So Dark is, runs in a Kubernetes cluster. And so I started building the new stuff with some like better best practices, which included using its own namespace. Um, and I ended up with this situation where the load balancer won't send it to the old thing and the new thing because they're in different namespaces. And I'm just like, oh, I could redo all this, but like I'd set up a bunch of firewall rules. And so I'm just sort of like hoping that Google support can find me a solution to this. Um, and hopefully I will have something on Monday or Tuesday, where the actual canvases being run in Dark, but I did not manage to get that bit over the line just yet.
Cool. And once you start to get 1 or 2 canvases running, and you see, parity between those two, then what? Will you have users flip themselves on for additional canvases, or what's like the rollout?
No, I think it'll mostly be us doing it for them. So mostly it'll be like switching over and looking for differences in status codes. So like if a bunch of things start to go 500, or that there start to be a bunch of exceptions. One of the things I'm working on at the moment is making sure that our exception framework or our exception tracker is fully hooked up, and that I can see anything that's happening, and making sure that the our open telemetry for actually running Dark is there as well, so that we can see whenever any issues come up, to be able to monitor things. So probably do things like all canvases starting with the letter A, and part of the intent is to do sort of I guess it's not exactly a brownout, but switch things over for an hour, switch things back, see if any problems have happened, and then eventually switch to like 50% of canvases for half a day, and just sort of gradually move it up like that.
Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, you migrated from OCaml to F# for a number of reasons, including just support for third parties such as database engines and whatnot, and also multi-threading and async. Besides those, I think I saw some posts earlier that they mentioned language problems as well, maybe some limitations within OCaml. Was async the most of that, or were there other things in OCaml that were lacking?
There was a couple of things. So for example, we were using this technology called JS of OCaml, which compiles OCaml to JavaScript, and that's what runs in the client. And a bunch of the libraries that we use C extensions weren't able to be compiled to that. Mm-hmm. And in F#, because everything is sort of written in C# and .NET, you have things like the regex library, and the cryptography stuff, and those are all written in F#, and so they can be compiled into Blazor is their WASM thing. So the thing that we're using to compile the F# code to run in the editor is called Blazor. And so we can move a bunch of those functions over. So there's, I don't know, probably like 50% of the stuff that you would have to like click a button to run it on the back end and get the response can now actually run in the client.
Yeah, it's been neat seeing. I feel like most Blazor use cases are trying to build like an enterprise app from the ground up, or maybe reusing some components that have existed long before. I think this is an interesting use case where we're kind of using it just as a compiled backend.
It's funny. I was just working on a blog post about this, because I think that that Blazor trying to be this like, oh, it's a UI thing that you can write in C# and have it compile. Nobody wants that. I don't understand why they're doing it. Versus like you can compile your C# or F# code into WASM, like the hottest new technology of the web development world, which is the biggest part of the entire IT world. It's like, why are they focusing on this dumb UI stuff, which nobody wants when everyone's going to do React anyway?
Yeah, it's interesting because most of the rest of the WebAssembly world seems to be focusing on the, hey, we can compile regular code into web stuff, and .NET is not doing that. .NET's been very much focused on
they have all the technology to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you had to like adjust certain scripts to get things to load in a web worker. I think like web work would be a pretty common use case.
Yeah.
Not to poo-poo any on the Blazor people, but I thought it was interesting that that use case hasn't been seen as much.
Yeah. I have a blog post coming out next week about this that just reiterates what I just said in possibly more aggressive language.
That sounds great. Someone asked the question if we were looking for public users of the F# backend. But
yes,
I think
that would be wonderful. If you would like to volunteer your canvases to be switched over, just drop your DM me in the dark Slack is probably the right way to go about that. If you're not in the dark Slack, this is how you join. Just posting it in the on the Twitch. And yeah, I can flip your canvases over, and you can be our test
Guinea pig. Yeah.
guinea pig. There we go. I was like hamster. It was a gerbil. No, it's a guinea. You can be our guinea pig.
Cool. So now that the rewrite is wrapping up and we're migrating canvases over, you finally get to unlock that technical debt. What are you looking forward to resolving most quickly? I mean, obviously you have drivers available that you didn't have available before because .NET's just huge.
Well, I think that we're going to have a couple of months of like slowly deleting the old stuff. So not everything is fully switched over, and when we have things in production, one of the compromises I had to make was that all of Dark programs are stored in our database, but they're stored in this binary format that uses this weird OCaml thing, and so I have another web server that runs next to the F# web server so that it will like do the translation. And apart from adding probably 100 milliseconds to every request, that is sort of unreliable or could potentially be unreliable and something I want to get rid of. And so we have a bunch of things like that where we're just going to have to delete the old thing. So for example, static assets, I've decided not to port to F#, and instead I'm going to port it to a dark canvas. And so what I'm hoping we can do is we can add things to Dark that support that use case, and then eventually we will delete that old piece of code. So there's a bunch of things like that, just like transitioning more of the stuff to Dark. And I actually maybe the thing I'm most looking forward to is not having any timeouts. So a lot of requests time out with a 503 error because we don't have async in the OCaml version. It's not that OCaml can't support async. People in the OCaml community got annoyed when I said that. It was really that I just didn't know how to use it. But the F# stuff is fully asynced up, and it'll be really good to just have that kind of reliability, and to then be able to look at errors and see things that are actually within our control.
Cool. Yeah, I think would be good to do now is to review just general near-term priorities. Of course, the F# migration is the big one, just making sure we kind of migrate canvases over. But besides that, I know there's some other near-term priorities. Can you speak to those? And then I guess also I believe that one of the things that that you were looking forward to was dealing with the queues not being in database. Is that something we can resolve quickly or soon?
Yeah, I mean it's going to take a bit of a rewrite, but I think it's the sort of queues in particular are the sort of thing that are a 2 or 3 day rewrite as opposed to a 2-week rewrite.
Yeah.
So let me just share my screen here.
Okay.
Now that I've forbidden everyone else from doing it. Okay. We should see Twitchception. There we go. Okay. So what we have at the moment, this is the project that we're using to manage Dark. It's called Darklang priorities. I'll just pop this into the. Did something weird here. There we go. I'll just pop this into the Twitch so that you can follow along at home. So the first two columns, this is what we're working on, and these are things that are left in the F# rewrite. But let's talk about things that are coming up. The important tech debt, that's sort of what you're asking about. And yeah, moving traces from the database, that really is our big one. This one here. So we're paying about $3,000 a month for database storage. And really we should be paying about $100 a month. And the reason for that is that we have all of these traces in our database. We have 10 terabytes of traces in our database. And really the traces should not have been stored in a database. They should have been stored in storage. And we have one one user who's doing a lot of stuff, and the 10 terabytes are basically all his stuff. And I've actually deleted it from the database, but Google doesn't just give you your money back. They are still charging me, so we need to get that down. And so that's kind of the thing I'm most excited about.
That's interesting. For some reason, I recalled that we would only restore the last, like, I think 10 traces or so per thing. Is that not right?
Yeah, and we delete all the other traces
Right.
after that. But the kind of query that you need to write for a delete in Postgres was locking up the database, so we had to disable it for that user. So we just weren't able to delete any of their stuff. And then I've gradually been watching the database go from 200 gigabytes to 10 terabytes. And eventually I realized I should just not store traces for this user. But we were at 10 terabytes before I did that. Smart.
Cool. So there's that in the tech debt. You want to talk through some other priorities here?
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the important tech debt because those are kind of tedious from a product perspective. I think the thing that's really interesting is a bunch of the stuff was sort of redone, and as we went through we wrote a bunch of cleanup notes, and there's a link actually to here of just everything in the code base that says cleanup on it. And there, so anything that has this sort of cleanup note, I made everything work the same and work exactly the same, including dumb error messages, dumb behavior where I could. And so, there's just a bunch of things where I'm going to be like, okay, I'm going to make a new version of this function. So a bunch of date functions, a bunch of preview stuff. So we preview the wrong things in some cases. Preview being the values that you see as you're using the dark editor. Here's one where I'm stripping milliseconds from our thing because OCaml didn't have milliseconds, or our version of it in OCaml didn't have milliseconds in the thing. I'm trying to look at some other examples here. There's a bunch of things where I talked about a minute ago, the crypto stuff, crypto meaning cryptography, not scams. So anything that's making a SHA-384 of something, or base64, all of that is going to be moved into the client. There's going to be a new version of the HTTP client, which uses HTTP3. I didn't want anyone to accidentally switch to HTTP3 in case there was, certainly I know headers are different. The HTTP3 uses all lowercase headers, and so I didn't want anyone's code to break on the basis of our headers being case sensitive versus case insensitive. If we accidentally moved you from, if you were talking to a server that talks HTTP3 and 1 but not 2, I didn't want that to change. So we'll make new versions of the HTTP clients that use HTTP3, and that also, and Stachu has been working through a bunch of the HTTP client stuff, but it's a nightmare. It's just we do this in this case and we use this in this case, and it's we need to simplify the logic and not have all these weird edge cases. And so we made a note of a ton of the weird edge cases that we're going to remove, and so there'll be a new version of the HTTP client. Here's another one. So the date cleanups. So any date before 1970 comes out as a negative, and it's all right, we're going to have new versions of the date functions that don't have that dumb behavior. So those are kind of there's just a big list of those. And then one of the other major changes that that the new version has is that we used real types. So in the old version, we would have, for example, we would have a list. In the new version, we have a list of ints, or we have a list of lists of ints, or whatever it is. And so that gives us enough to be able to show better types in the editor, and also to add a type checker to the editor. And the type checker in the editor can actually, we can actually seem like we're a real functional programming language, or a real statically typed language, instead of the sort of like fake, like we've really been faking it with our dynamic language under the hood. But having having a type checker in the editor, I think will make a big difference for how the language feels, and make it really kind of just a little more consistent.
Cool, that makes sense. And then, so those are some near-term priorities. Are the only other we should go over? I guess we have a bunch of low-hanging fruit. Yeah, if anyone is looking to contribute.
So like characters, tuples, turning, actually there's a bunch of fixes here. Oh yeah, actually here's one. The old, so the OCaml code doesn't compile on OS X on old laptops. So I think if you have an i5, it miscompiles. And so users weren't able to contribute because the server wouldn't even start up. So it'll be nice to like allow everyone to contribute.
Was that just an OCaml limitation, or what was that?
It was some of the cryptography libraries were using SIMD instructions that were on i7s but not i5s. So don't need to do those anymore. Yeah, let's see what else is sort of these are all nice simple low-hanging fruits, but the real stuff is in, or the really interesting things that we're going to be working on in the future is in the roadmap. So this is where I've started putting the all of the what we actually want the language to be, and the editor and that sort of thing. So it used to be in roadmap.darklang.com, and you can still see roadmap.darklang.com, and a bunch of the stuff in here is not done, and a bunch of it is yet to be ported over to the GitHub issues. But we're going to be doing it all in GitHub issues from now on. And there's sort of a varied collection. So there's fixing the stuff that we know doesn't work. There's the HTTP stuff, the HTTP client and the HTTP framework, a bunch of types that aren't done all that well. Stuff like ifs, not using booleans, that kind of thing. But then there's also I refer to this as framework, and so notification system, I think, is going to be one of the more exciting things. If you build something in Dark, we should tell you when errors happen. We should also tell you, some sort of analytics, even if it's just like send you a daily email of like, 500 people, there were 500 web requests today. One of the themes of the feedback that we got about Dark is that people don't feel safe writing stuff in Dark. And they don't feel safe because they don't know if like stuff keeps working. They don't know like if changes are being made. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff around that I want to build. And one of them, this notification thing, is sort of like, telemetry, error tracking, that sort of thing. We want you to be able to get a notification when there's an error, or just like when you would like to know about it. So like maybe someone makes a request to a header that you've never, or to an edge case that you haven't done yet. You can just put a little call to the notification, and then you'll get an email, or however you prefer to set up your personal notifications. And so start to do more sort of like higher level I suppose you'd almost call it like software development lifecycle stuff, as opposed to just like programming language stuff. But as long as we own the entire thing, you're not able to use the other stuff. You can't use Sentry or Rollbar. You can't use OpenTelemetry or Honeycomb or any of that sort of thing. So you kind of rely on us to provide that sense of security. So we need to build that stuff, and that's one of the major reasons why I want to rewrite more of Dark stuff in Dark itself, so that we're actually actively managing that stuff and being sort of eating our own dog food.
How this is a open-ended question. How deep of the language do you think can be in Dark itself, or not necessarily the language, but the framework or tooling?
So the rule that I was using, or sort of the rule of thumb I was using, was if this goes down, will we be unable to bring it back up? So for example, rebuilding static asset upload in Dark. Yeah, if that goes down, okay, we won't be able to upload static assets, but that's not something that people do, or that's not essential to bringing the system back up. One thing that was essential to bringing the system back up is being able to log in, and we switched our login to Auth0 a while back. And that actually goes through a couple of Dark canvases. So like if Dark is down, if we break the login system, then we will not be able to log in to fix it via Dark. And so I have a workaround. I have a sort of an emergency login script that will give me a session token so that I would be able to log in to fix the login script. So that's sort of a good rule of thumb. So what can be built in Dark is any sort of like any of the business logic can really be done in Dark. And any of the like core capabilities probably need to be built in F#. So as an example, a HTTP client, you can't write a HTTP client in Dark. But we can expose a very simple HTTP client, one that just like takes bytes, sends bytes, gets headers, that sort of thing. And then allow people, including ourselves, to build HTTP clients on top of that. So that's kind of the way that we want to go with it, building packages, building middleware. So we did the same thing with HTTP. There's this like HTTP framework that is like very, it'll translate the encoding. It will, parse the JSON. And as a result, it won't you can't actually upload bytes because we'll automatically parse the JSON, and bytes aren't JSON. So we want to change that to, okay, a HTTP framework that receives bytes, and then everything else can be written in Dark, and we can expose the JSON parser if we need to as a Dark function, and let people have their own middlewares and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, and then once the package manager ecosystem is more fleshed out, people will be able to, I guess, ideally fork some of these implementations too. Let's say they don't like the static assets library, they can fork that and then, I don't know, adjust it in whatever way they want.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they're maybe they don't like a particular. I remember one thing was that a user was receiving bsong, which is Mongo's sort of extension of JSON, because they were talking to a Mongo server that was sitting out in the world. And so we changed the HTTP client to return the raw value. But why did we do that? You don't need the HTTP client to be the be all, the end all. They could have just made a raw request and then done their transformation and then done their JSON parser or whatever they needed if we had enabled that in sort of low level components. And stuff like the notification system, like we could put most of that into Dark. So we could have when a thing happens that needs a notification, we could put that into a queue in the notification system, and then it can load your settings from its own database store and see like, oh, this person wants to be notified no more than once a day, and that can all be implemented in a dark canvas. And in particular, and this is a place I want to go with this, is that all of that logic can be, the intent is that all of those canvases will be public canvases. So that people can see how dark is written, people can contribute, make, whatever the pull request or the version of pull request is in the dark world, all of that can happen. Yeah, so I can go through more of the roadmap and sort of discuss where we're looking to go, but where should we start?
That's a good question. Yeah, I guess we'll start at the lowest level, which would be language.
Okay, so kind of there's if we look at I'm actually going to do this in the new one. So if we look at sort of like built-in types, there's a bunch of stuff that isn't supported yet. So very very simple stuff like the editor should allow negative numbers. Like you can't have a negative number in the editor right now. If you try to put a minus, it'll do something weird. And so you can subtract something. So you can like say let -1 equals 0 -1 and then multiply it by another number or whatever. And so in that you'll see it's marked contributor friendly. So this is something that where I think that it's like spec'd enough that a user could implement it. And so I have like a UX specified for what should happen for this one. But then with integers, there's a bunch of like really kind of complicated stuff. So like, I don't know if it's like complicated is the word, but like, certainly there's some complexity to it. So for example, if you do integer division by 0, what are you supposed to get? And in a lot of languages, you get like an exception being thrown, but Dart doesn't have exceptions. So really, you should have a result. But if you have a result, then that kind of breaks up the integer, doing simple arithmetic, and so that kind of needs some thought applied to it into like how it can be made a good experience, basically. Similar, another one. So there's this needs thought label here. The solution is unknown, and discussion and feedback is helpful in deciding what to do. So we don't know the answer. So in this one, in the transition to F#, I actually made integers to be infinite precision. So that's instead of being 64-bit or whatever, they can be any size. This is called big int or big integer in a lot of languages. And I realized that there was a sort of an error in, I think the technical term for this is an impedance mismatch, but where infinite precision wasn't going to work with sort of future database choices. And so I thought, I'm just going to like pare this back. I'm just going to go back to 64-bit ints, just like in OCaml. Well, OCaml is 63-bit ints, but we will switch to 64-bit ints. And we can sort of evaluate where we're at when we've made like future infrastructure choices around databases and that kind of thing. So yeah, so that's interesting. I'm not going to go through all of these, but in strings, there's the string escaping and the string interpolation, which are things that users have really wanted. And then there's also a bunch of sort of broken Unicode things, like if you try to do a complicated Unicode character in the editor, it doesn't quite work. The language actually supports Unicode exceptionally well. So we use these things which are called extended Grapheme clusters for our characters. An extended Grapheme cluster is a character that you see on the screen. So if you're looking at some emoji on the screen or on your mobile or whatever, that one character can be represented as a single dark character. but we don't have that fully working in the editor, especially for like things that have combining characters, or skin tones, genders, that sort of thing. They're all like not covered particularly well, and that's even before we get to like right to left, which doesn't work even slightly. So we there's a bunch of stuff around that we want to get right, but the ones that people are really going to where people are really struggling is this sort of like new line, escaping, wrapping stuff, and the string interpolation. So as I mentioned, characters exist, but you can't actually create them. So adding the ability to create characters and adding character stuff to the standard lib, so to convert things, back and forth to integers, or like tell you is something in ASCII, that kind of thing. Floats. Nothing interesting is happening in the floats thing, so we'll skip that. Tuples. We had a contribution for the for tuples, but I didn't merge it before we did the rewrite, so now that's going to have to be ported over. And one thing I'm really looking forward to is we have these fake tuples in a bunch of the places. So if you do like list head, wait, is head one of them? No, it's not head. It's something else. Oh yeah. If you do any database functions where you get the key and the value, or you do like map convert to a list, what you'll get is a fake tuple, which is a list with two values, and the two values will have different types, which is ridiculous because we're a statically typed language.
So it's a JavaScript list, basically, or a JavaScript tuple.
Yeah, exactly, a JavaScript tuple. So we want to get those to real tuple. I say tuple, whatever. And then get finally deprecate and get rid of that old shit. So the language obviously is designed for deprecating. We can just deprecate functions, and I look forward to deprecating the ones that are just really bad. Let me see the other, there's kind of some list stuff here. You can't do pattern matching on lists. In some cases, you can get runtime errors in the list as like list values instead of the error being propagated. So that kind of thing is intended to be done. I'm kind of hoping that we can re-implement lists and arrays. So the idea with lists in Dark is that they are that you shouldn't think about whether you want a list or an array or something that you push to the back of or to the front of or resize or iterate, or kind of what is the speed of various operations is something that we should handle for you. But right now they're implemented as linked lists, and linked lists have terrible performance, especially like if you keep adding things to the back, that's an order n squared operation. And so I want to switch to using immutable vectors, which should have much better performance. But so far that we still need to identify what that would be. But that's kind of where we hope to go. So that's lists. I'm gonna have to not just like go through each thing individually here. So maybe someone from the audience can tell me things that they're actually interested in discussions of, and otherwise we can move on to the next bit of the roadmap. Or if no one is doing it, Stachu, you can tell me what you're interested in.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I'm especially curious or interested in lists being homogeneous right now. That you can have different types in them. So that's certainly, as a statically typed language, something to go for. Sets and whatnot are good.
There's an interesting thing in I think I have it under bytes, that we have lists, and so you have kind of list events or whatever, but really you should be able to have list of bytes, a list of you know, unsigned 8-bit characters, or whatever we
Hmm.
call them, and there shouldn't just be this byte thing that's there. And bytes is there because it's an important performance optimization. We don't want to take every byte, wrap it in another 8-bit thing, and then put a list of these, you know, with heap indirection um, things. Um, but it's, you know, it's kind of blocked because lists can be heterogeneous. You can put anything into the list, and that's kind of the semantics of the language at the moment. So I do want to switch to a thing where lists are heterogeneous. Where lists are homogeneous, where everything in the list can be the same type, and then we can have, you know, we can have our list type be int list, or you know, something like that that actually uses you know, more high performance implementation under the hood.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, the thing that I'm interested more than any of these ones at the top would be just user defined types. Right now, you can create
Mm-hmm.
records, which work, but it'll be great to get user defined types, whether maybe you call those aliases. Uh,
Yeah, so let's take a look at what's in the roadmap for real types. So okay, I guess I didn't write a whole lot there. Maybe in, yeah, not a lot there. So let me just talk about that a little bit. So it is technically possible to create a record in Dark, to create a type which specifies a record. Um, but it's not really usable anywhere except for function arguments. Um, and so we actually took it out of the sidebar, um, just so that people weren't confused about why this thing exists that really isn't usable anywhere. Um, so one of the first places we want to use this is in databases. So database schemas currently use um, uh, their just their own like record looking thing, but we want types to be there, so you can create a type and then you can get that type and pass it around, and you know, store it in a database directly. So you know, first step is allow records to be used in more places, and then the second step is like make database one of those places, make HTTP handlers one of those places, so that, you know, the sort of end, really what I want is a type at one end, a type at the other end, and a types everywhere in between, and the type checker telling you this is safe, this is good. Um, and so getting that in, and then enums, of course. So enums, they're sometimes called variants or subtypes, but you know, these are, of course, I don't have any docs in this either. But the only ones in Dark at the moment are the result type and the option type, and even those are, they're kind of hard coded in. So what we want is those to be uh, user extendable, and then to use them in the standard library as well. There's a bunch of cases where it would be useful to have like an either type, or you know, maybe a tree type or something like that, that are actually like written in Dark and part of the standard library.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, yeah, I see the note there about modules and namespacing. Whether you have notes there or not, that's one thing that when I've built
Let's
Dark
see.
programs that I feel
Yeah.
like I've wanted more of. Just because right now you have the canvas, and it's great for getting stuff up very quickly. But it'd be great to kind of like be able to zoom in and out of subspaces within the
Yeah.
canvas.
Yeah. You know, I do actually have a prototype for that somewhere. Let's see if I can find it.
Right. Yeah, that might be under the editor.
I was just clicking through it recently, and I saw it, and I was like, that's a thing that we should. There we go. There we go. Okay, so this is a prototype of like how we actually kind of want Dark to be for the canvas. Um, let me zoom in on this. Um, so the idea is that um, you know, people like to organize things. We call these groups. It's a nice, you know, let's just call it groups for a second. So, you want to group off your projects thing from your users thing and then see the connections between them. See the connections between the endpoints, the HTTP endpoints and the databases, see how much traffic is flowing between them so that you can see what's important and what's not. And then show you sort of like high level things like analytics and stuff in the canvas, or the types and that sort of thing. And then have the code editing thing be a thing that you zoom down into. Probably like multi-stage zoom, but maybe you can zoom into the users and you'll see code for all of the handlers, and then use this for things like permissions and see how much things cost and sort of like all this thing sort of as overlays of this top level view. And obviously we're quite far from that. Let's take a look at what Dark actually is. I'm gonna use a blank thing maybe. No, this one's fine. Okay, there we go. So now what we have is just like code enabled all over the place, and there's no structure to it. You can just drag things to wherever you like. This is not how we intended things to be. And some people do like this sort of like canvas metaphor. But I think the two things that they like about the canvas metaphor is, one, that there's sort of a visual, that they can visually cluster things together that are logically together, and the other that they can sort of see code without opening sort of the new file or whatever. And I think that there's that those advantages can be created in a form that doesn't have all the downsides of the current Dark canvas.
While we're here, you mentioned earlier you'd like the ability to see errors within the canvas itself. Are you imagining those similar to 404s? Where you kind of like see it as a notification on the side?
Yeah, so at the moment, you have traces. They're really, a trace which had an error, or like if you think about error notification, it's just a trace connected to, the fact that this has been an error. So all we really need to have trace notifications is a list of traces that had like a 500 result or a 400 result. And that's, in the UI, we tried this initially and we didn't end up with a really good UI. We just made them red. We didn't save them or anything, but we just kind of made them red. And that was very confusing, but also I think it was buggy, and I think that was maybe why it was confusing. But yeah, just keeping track of them and showing, allowing you see the last, 100 errors, and in particular, allowing you replay those errors. Like, in Dark, if you're going to do something like a DB set, right, and it doesn't work, then you can make changes, you can fix the bug, and then for that trace, you can just do the DB set again. So you don't even need a user, or you don't even need your users to go back and swipe right, or send the message again, or whatever it is that they're doing. You can do it for them, and sort of like take things back to a consistent state. And so that's sort of part of the holistic view of the errors, that like not only do we want you to be able to find them, we want to tell you when they happen, and we want to let you fix them, and sort of like backfill the bad stuff.
Yeah, I've seen notes of you, this is slightly tangential, of you including a number of things in the package manager, right? You can include not only functions and types within a package, but potentially keyboard bindings or other things that are part of your workflow. I'm curious if canvas elements would be part of that story, if someone would be able to kind of customize how they interact visually. And it's a very far-reaching.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ideas about what we would put in the package manager. So one was, let's just call them templates. if you think about like a user login system, a user login needs a login page, it needs a password reset page, it needs a some sort of like OAuth page perhaps, or at least OAuth endpoints, um, or various different OAuths for the various different OAuth providers. That's kind of one thing that needs to be in the package in some way, in the package manager in some way. And there's a little bit of an issue. So we could have you sort of like dump this in and then edit it. The other thing we could have you do is we could have versioning be part of that. So you could import the endpoints to, or the templates to certain endpoints or certain like root or something like that. And then when there's a new version of it, it can be upgraded wholesale when you choose to do it, obviously. So that it's not just like code sitting here that like, oh, we don't know whether to upgrade you, or we don't know what to do with that. Some of the other stuff I've been thinking of, the only like really interesting thing that would be that I've thought that's like completely out of left field is have sort of like shared databases. So you could imagine if you're creating like a spam filtering solution, that you have like this shared data corpus where lots of dark users are contributing to this like shared data corpus, and that like it is shared via the mechanism of like a dark package.
Yeah, it's funny. I've thought a similar thing where, let's say there's collaborative data. This is kind of off the wall, but I'm into speed running on the side, right? It's just people submit their times, all these different things. They have all these different metrics that they're tracking in terms of like different segments of runs or whatever, and it'd be convenient to have a centralized store of this data and centralized types or whatever, where given this kind of individually owned but collaboratively shared data set, you could compare your different metrics against each other to figure out where you're doing well or poorly against each other. I think there's a lot of space for that, not only in kind of I think there's a lot of space for that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I think that there's like a couple of interesting things that we can do with that. But I think the main thing is that like we need to support the basics. We need to support packages. We need to support types. So like functions and types, and when we get those, we will be in a better position to think about like some of the more advanced shit.
Yeah, no dreaming yet.
Yeah. That's actually kind of one of the frustrating things about having done this rewrite for the last year. That every time I touch something, I'm like, oh, I want to fix this in so many ways, and it's like, no.
But I shouldn't.
Yeah, not today. So I'm so excited to do like anything else that's not rewriting the existing stuff.
Yeah, I bet. Speaking of things that aren't through rewrite, there's a bunch of open issues right now that are contributor friendly. For anyone listening who's curious to do that, where could they go to kind of get started in Dark and either contribute or just kind of run Dark locally and play with it? I know there's that tag. Can you speak through that?
So I'm just here's the 46 open things, but actually let me just point to the GitHub first.
Yeah, and if anyone here hasn't been in Dark yet or played with it, it's pretty easy to get started.
Yeah, so there's a link to the here we go, contributor docs, and so there's like a getting started with the repo, adding tests. There's sort of descriptions of the back end and the front end, and that sort of thing. So there's lots of information in the contributor guide about how to contribute. But to get started, it's actually like trivial. Everything is Dockerized. All of our dependencies and that sort of thing are in there. So generally, there's like this is the commands to get started if you're not using VS Code, and that should like do the whole thing to get Dark set up on your machine. And so really then the main thing is about like how do people actually like sorry, what should people be working on? And so there's a contributor friendly thing, and right now the only things that are really doable until we get the rewrite switched over to F#, like it doesn't need to be fully done, but we need to like not be relying on the OCaml stuff anymore, um, is um, is either stuff that's part of the um, rewrite, or is stuff that's part of the editor. So you can see this editor tag here, or the fluid tag is part of that. So like allowing negative numbers, making strings work well with new lines. Those are things that like work pretty nicely, allowing copy pasting in traces. There's a bunch of them that are in the editor and that are like very easy to support right now. And then there's the ones that are in the actual in the Darklang priorities. So like in the F# rewrite and the in progress thing, there's a couple of things that are contributor friendly. Testing. But this is a little boring, but good sort of like step into to a new code base. Here's the list of functions that don't have any tests. And so like, adding a couple of tests to them is extremely easy to do. There's a guide. There's a guide in the contributor thing that specifically walks through adding a test and setting up the repo, adding a test, making the first pull request. Really steps people through like every single step of it. And I think it should be a fairly straightforward process. And where it isn't, we are extremely interested in like what problems people have with like just getting started. So we can help like smooth those out.
Yeah, open up pairing sessions.
Yeah, I actually have a where is it? Yeah, so there's actually a link here in my Calendly where you can book a pairing session with me to get started. No one has used that yet, except you, Stachu, but that doesn't count. You were working here. But I'm interested to see if like someday someone will actually use this link to help contribute.
That sounds good.
Cool. Was there anything else on that we wanted to talk about?
That's mostly it. I mean, I'm sure as the weeks go on, we'll have more and more dreams to do as the rewrite wraps up, and we can focus on building the new stuff.
Yeah,
which is good. Oh yeah, I guess the other thing that I was curious about was so there's all these changes that we want to make and improvements we want to make, and some of these things where they're new, we don't have to worry about migration because they are just new, right? There's no one using the existing stuff. In terms of migrating to future language versions where there might be breakages and such, how do you see that going?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot because let me show you some dark standard libraries, and this will sort of become clear why there's a bit of an issue. So the backend source lib execution, and then the runtime types. So let's find there we go. Okay, so this is an actual dark value. All right, so we call it a deval, and it can be an int or a double or a bool or a bunch of things. And if we want to make, let's say we want to make a new type of list that is only, or we want to transition lists over to only being homogeneous, or we want to like make a change to an if statement where the where it only uses booleans and doesn't use like anything else. that, all of those could potentially break someone's code. And breaking people's code is a thing that we don't want to do. We want to migrate the language without having sort of the Python 2 to 3 thing, but we also don't want to have your code breaks without you even noticing. So what I had been thinking is like, okay, we can make a new version of these runtime types. We can make a new version of the interpreter. And we can have the new behavior, and then users can select into the old behavior, the new behavior, or whatever. And the more I thought about that, the more of a nightmare that it really seemed. In principle, because we have these standard library functions. So let's say libfloat here, and so this is a function which I guess rounds a floating number into an integer, and here is the actual code that implements it. Actually, really just this line here. So it takes a float, and what are we going to do for the new float type, right? We're going to have, because of the way types work, it's not just going to be that there's a new signature here with dfloat, 2 or whatever. But if dfloat2 is a separate type, then we have to actually make a new built-in function, or we can have the built-in function which uses which is abstracted on the type, but then that has problems when we try to make it concrete, and we try to actually implement the code. So we're really sort of in a situation where if we make changes to the language, we have to copy, I don't know, like 30,000 lines of code, maybe 20,000 lines of code, or 10, but a lot of code. And so it really doesn't make sense to do that. And so I think that it will look a little more like in the, where's the execution? More like adding sort of special behavior to just like extending the deval and the expression with the new stuff, and then getting rid of the old stuff. So we will perhaps change it to be maybe add new list functions that only support homogeneous lists, and then we can add an homogeneous list as well, or we can make the list here be sorry, the D list be a list of devals, a heterogeneous list or homogeneous list, and we'll add this in here, and then we'll add a type checker, and then we'll there's a bunch of functions that will error instead of putting things into the homogeneous list. So that
right. So breaking down that D list into a sub DU with both of the types, and then in the function we'll just have to adjust a little bit to handle both cases.
Yeah, and in particular, creating a migration path that is that users can opt into, and that users also don't have to opt into, so that we can just like test when once we add a type checker, we can say this user, we can guarantee that they will not have this problem, and we can switch them over automatically to the homogeneous list.
That sounds good. Yeah, that seems like a much smoother path. Because it'd be hard to avoid the Python 2 to 3 problem otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of it we can do ourselves because Dark is every Dark program is in our database, so we can see what people are actually doing. I started adding things to telemetry. In fact, I made one of these changes recently, where something just looked like it was going to be impossible to port, and so I just like did a test: is anyone actually using this? And after 2 weeks, no, it had never happened. And I was just like, all right, we can switch this over safely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. So we're probably going to try to have one of these every I know 2 weeks, every 2 weeks feels a bit, feels like a lot, but every 2 to 3 weeks, let's say.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to talk about the roadmaps. We're going to talk about what changes have been made in the previous weeks. And we are hoping to have some users sort of showcase the kind of thing that they've built in Dark. So if you're someone who wants to show off what you built, or just even talk through what you can build in Dark, especially for users who haven't taken the plunge yet, that'd be really cool.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have
know.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have part of it just be if even if you just come with an idea of, hey, is this something that you could build in Dark, and we could pair it all together, just writing it in Dark canvas itself. That could be fun. I know I have like a few projects that I think, oh, well, this would be nice to build this little thing. Dark's been great for just writing one-off programs that just live, and I don't have to worry about setup or infra or anything.
I have a user who he messaged me every now and then about what he builds, and very often what he builds is like one handler only that has about 4 lines, and that someone paid him like 10 grand to build, because just like it, code is expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny every time I get one of those, like, oh, how much does this one cost?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I've used it for something similar like that. We built like a kiosk application, and they needed like an email form, right? They had like a UI with like, please enter your email address so we can email you later. Well, that's the easy way to just say, well, as soon as you post that, just post it to the Dark handler and set it up in a Dark store.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so much, like, the idea of computing is just like getting data, storing it, and sending it somewhere else, and it's like it's so trivial, and like, I know it bothers me that it's not really trivial for people to actually like use this stuff.
Yeah.
Every time I set up a new Kubernetes service, I'm just like, why is there so much fucking work in this?
Yeah, so much overhead.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We'll hopefully be doing more stuff on this Twitch, and we will be streaming some stuff, and then we will have another one of these meetups in a couple of weeks. There's a link in the blog post to somewhere you can sign up to get notifications. But we will also be posting about it on our Twitter and in our community Slack. Hope to see you then.
All right. See ya.